The moment he appeared, everything changed, though no one realized it at first. A silent storm disguised in a tailored suit. He didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't even raise his voice. Still, within minutes, alarms were tripped, assumptions were made, and the institution he stood inside did exactly what it had always done: reacted to the wrong threat. They saw a man they believed they could corner, contain, and dismiss. What they didn't see was what he carried, not just in the briefcase, but in his purpose. He wasn't there to cause a scene. He was there to end the performance. What came next would shake the walls of power, rip secrets into daylight, and force justice to look itself in the mirror. Like the story? Hit that subscribe button, give it a like, and let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And how do you think this ends? The double glass doors of Hamilton Central Bank whooshed open with a pneumatic hiss, ushering in the dry summer air along with a man who moved like he belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. Malcolm Harris stepped into the lobby dressed in a tailored charcoal suit with a crisp white shirt and black tie. His presence was sharp, deliberate, yet nonchalant. In his right hand, he carried a sleek black leather briefcase, polished, professional, and undeniably unremarkable to most. But not to Rick Carson. Stationed near the security desk, Rick straightened up the moment he saw Malcolm cross the threshold. He had been sipping stale coffee and scrolling through a college football forum on his phone just moments before, but now his gaze locked on the newcomer like a heat-seeking missile. Rick Carson had worked at this bank for 17 years. He wasn't technically law enforcement, but he sure liked to act like it. He wore his badge like a sheriff in a Western film, his belt heavy with a baton he hadn't used in over a decade. His gut reaction to Malcolm Harris was immediate and subconscious, or maybe not so subconscious at all. Rick stepped away from the desk, blocking Malcolm's path before the man had even made it 5 paces inside. "Excuse me, sir," Rick said loudly, his voice echoing slightly through the high-ceilinged lobby. A few heads turned. Malcolm stopped mid-step, offering a courteous smile. "Good morning," he said. "Is there an issue?" Rick's eyes dropped immediately to the briefcase. "What's in the bag?" Malcolm raised an eyebrow, still holding his smile. "Documents. Business-related. I have an appointment with one of your executives." "I'll need you to open it," Rick said flatly. "Why?" Malcolm asked calmly. Rick squared his shoulders. "Because it looks suspicious." Malcolm's smile faltered ever so slightly. "Suspicious? How?" "That's not really up for debate," Rick replied. "Now I need you to place the bag on that table, step back, and open it." Malcolm glanced over to the reception desk, where a young woman named Tara had stood up, clearly unsure how to intervene. "Is this normal procedure?" Malcolm asked her. Tara hesitated. Not usually, no." "I'm doing my job," Rick snapped. "If you've got nothing to hide, sir, then there's no problem." Malcolm slowly placed the briefcase on the small table near the waiting chairs. "May I show you my ID first?" he asked, voice calm measured. Rick didn't respond immediately. He looked Malcolm up and down, as if assessing a threat. "Make it quick," he muttered. Malcolm reached into his jacket pocket with slow, deliberate movements and pulled out a leather wallet. Inside were 2 cards, his driver's license and a company ID bearing the name Harris and Thorne Investigative Counsel. "Malcolm Harris," he said, holding both out. "I have a 10:30 appointment with Director Langston." Rick barely looked at the cards before his eyes drifted back to the briefcase like it had just started ticking. "Still need to check the bag." "Even after verifying my identity?" Malcolm asked. "Is there a specific threat alert I'm unaware of?" "Standard protocol," Rick lied. Malcolm smiled again, but there was no warmth behind it this time. "Interesting. I walked through metal detectors. I showed you my ID. I announced my appointment. Still suspicious." Rick didn't answer. Behind him, 2 older gentlemen had paused their conversation near the investment advisory counter. One of them shook his head disapprovingly. "Just open the damn thing," Rick barked. Malcolm unclasped the briefcase. The locks snapped open, clean, quiet. He turned it slightly, tilting it toward Rick, then opened the lid fully. Inside were a stack of neatly organized manila folders, a leather-bound notepad, and a black pen clipped to its spine. No wires, no strange devices, no threat, Satisfied? Malcolm asked, tone as smooth as silk but sharp as broken glass. Rick stared down at the papers. His expression faltered. For a moment, he said nothing. Tara, at the desk, cleared her throat. "Mr. Harris," she called. "Director Langston just buzzed. He's ready for you upstairs." "Thank you," Malcolm replied, closing the briefcase and locking it again. Rick stepped slightly to the side, but couldn't quite meet Malcolm's eyes. "Are you detaining me, or is this another example of discretionary harassment?" Rick ignored the question and barked toward the front desk. "Tara, cancel his elevator access. Now." The young receptionist looked stunned but tapped her screen, disabling the call button as instructed. "Sir," she said cautiously, "Director Langston isn't the one handling security." Rick cut her off. "I am." Rick then turned back to Malcolm, gesturing aggressively toward a row of waiting chairs positioned just off-center in the lobby. "Sit down. Right there." Malcolm's eyebrows lifted in disbelief. "Pardon me?" "I said sit," Rick repeated, this time louder, the kind of tone meant to assert control rather than reason. A few people in the lobby were already staring. A mother holding a toddler froze near the check deposit kiosk. A man in a gray business suit nudged his companion and whispered something under his breath. Malcolm looked around, registering the sudden silence. "Is there a threat I've posed that justifies this public display? We have the right to stop suspicious individuals," Rick declared, puffing out his chest. "And I don't need to explain myself to you." Malcolm gave a quiet, sharp laugh, stepping toward the chairs but not sitting. "You want me to sit here in the middle of your lobby, like I'm under interrogation? You're making a spectacle because you're embarrassed, because you overreached and can't admit it." "I gave you an order," Rick snapped, stepping closer. "You don't give orders," Malcolm replied, still standing tall. "You're a security guard, and unless you plan to detain me unlawfully, I suggest you step aside." Just then, the sound of polished dress shoes echoed across the floor, interrupting the standoff. From a hallway to the right emerged a young man in a tailored slate gray suit, hair gelled back with meticulous precision, a Bluetooth headset clipped to his ear. Chad Benson, assistant branch manager and heir apparent to the office he believed he deserved. He looked young enough to still brag about his fraternity years, but moved like he owned the building. He surveyed the scene with narrowed eyes, instantly locking onto Malcolm with thinly veiled contempt. "What's going on here?" Chad asked Rick without taking his eyes off Malcolm. "I had it handled," Rick replied. "This gentleman's refusing to comply with a simple inspection and won't remain seated as instructed." "Gentlemen," Chad echoed, his lips curling. "You let him in? He had an appointment." Tara chimed in nervously from behind the desk. Chad rolled his eyes and walked up to Malcolm. "What is this? Who are you with?" Malcolm calmly extended his ID again. "Malcolm Harris. I'm here for a scheduled meeting with Director Langston. And right now, I'm being treated like a criminal because your security staff didn't like the way I entered your building." Chad didn't take the ID. Instead, he looked Malcolm up and down like inspecting a defect. "You're Harris? You don't look like the kind of guy Langston would be meeting with." Malcolm kept his composure. "What exactly does that mean?" Chad tilted his head, almost mockingly. "Let me be clear. You're not going anywhere until we verify who you are and why you're here. And if you raise your voice or cause any more disruption, I'll have you removed by the police. Understood?" A tense hush fell over the lobby. Every customer, every employee within earshot now openly watched. Malcolm glanced around, noting the stares, the discomfort, the silent witnesses too afraid or too indifferent to speak. He returned his gaze to Chad, his voice cool and razor-sharp. "Let me offer some clarity, Mr. Benson. I've shown identification. I've explained my purpose. You have no legal grounds to detain me, nor to deny me access to a scheduled executive meeting. What's happening here is not a security procedure. It's not protocol. It's discrimination, plain and simple. And the fact that you're continuing to escalate it publicly is not only unprofessional, it's legally actionable." Chad laughed dryly, more performative than amused. "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact," Malcolm replied. Now, unless you want to add obstruction of corporate audit operations to your growing list of mistakes, I recommend you call Director Langston. Or, better yet, call your legal team. Chad's smirk slipped, just slightly. You think tossing around legal buzzwords makes you someone important? No, Malcolm said. I think my appointment with the director already proves that. Before Chad could respond, a phone buzzed at the receptionist's desk. Tara answered quickly, then looked up in surprise. It's Director Langston, she called. He's asking why Mr. Harris hasn't been brought upstairs yet. Chad's jaw locked. He gave Rick a tight, frustrated look, then forced a smile that didn't touch his eyes. Apologies for the misunderstanding, he said, voice falsely cheerful. Let's get you to that meeting. Malcolm didn't move right away. He let the silence drag, watching both Rick and Chad squirm. Then, with slow precision, he picked up his briefcase and straightened his jacket. No apology needed, he said. This moment is being recorded for memory and accountability. Nearby, Chad Benson stared blankly at the glowing elevator display, still stunned by the abrupt phone call from Director Langston. His image of control had been shattered, even if only for a moment, and that gnawed at him more than he cared to admit. Rick, unwilling to let the situation go, felt something twist in his gut, a mixture of humiliation and suspicion that refused to loosen its grip. He muttered something under his breath and turned back to Tara at the front desk. He shouldn't be here, he said, voice low but tight with conviction. Something doesn't add up. Tara blinked. But Director Langston, I don't care who he says he is, Rick snapped, cutting her off. He bypassed protocol. That bag, he never let me search it properly. That was no inspection. He controlled the whole damn interaction. Chad, still stewing in silent frustration, suddenly found a new outlet for his discomfort. He could be bluffing, he muttered. You saw the way he carried himself. Confident. Too confident. Maybe he's not some executive contact. Maybe he's a plant. Someone sent to test our internal security, or worse. Rick's eyes narrowed as the gears turned in his head. We still don't know what's in that case, he said. I didn't get a good look. He opened it just enough. Could have had anything in there. He was way too smooth. That's not normal. Exactly, Chad said, his voice picking up energy. He walks in like he owns the place, gets mouthy when questioned, then name drops a meeting none of us were informed about. And Langston didn't even come down. He just called? That's not protocol either. Something's off. Rick nodded slowly, the story solidifying in his mind as truth. We need to act now, before it's too late. He reached for his radio. We've got a potential threat. Suspicious briefcase. Unknown contents. Possible impersonation. Lock the elevators and start Protocol 9. Tara's mouth fell open. Are you serious? He's in a meeting upstairs. Rick's tone was sharp and final. Then we'll pull him out of it, Chad added. And let's be clear, if something happens and we didn't act, it's on us. Within minutes, the lobby's mood shifted from tense to alarmed. A silent code was activated. Security cameras zoomed in. The maintenance staff was quietly alerted. Rick barked commands into his radio, demanding backup and reporting a possible threat. He used words like unverified, unknown individual, and non-compliant behavior. The word suspicious echoed through the security feed. And when that wasn't enough, he leaned hard into the one card he knew would provoke the necessary response. He claimed the briefcase might contain an explosive device. It was all speculation, but spoken with enough authority. It gained momentum. The lobby was quickly and discreetly thinned. Customers were ushered out with vague instructions. A mother and child were escorted to the exit. A group of college students applying for accounts was told the bank was undergoing an unexpected systems check. Fear began to ripple under the surface like oil in water. Meanwhile, upstairs, Malcolm sat in the executive conference room across from Director Langston, who looked every bit the corporate veteran, silver hair, bespoke suit, tired but intelligent eyes. Malcolm had just begun laying out the findings of his team's preliminary audit. His tone was professional, focused. These inconsistencies in your hiring records raise significant red flags, he said, opening one of the sealed folders from his briefcase. There's a pattern, Director, and I don't believe it's random. Langston rubbed his temple, nodding slowly. I've suspected something for months, he admitted, but I had no proof. Not until your firm stepped in. Before Malcolm could respond, the door to the conference room burst open. 2 uniformed officers entered, flanked by Rick and Chad, their faces grim and determined. Stand up, one of the officers barked. Malcolm's posture stiffened. Excuse me. Rick pointed. He's carrying an uninspected briefcase. Could be armed. Could be anything. That's absurd, Langston said, rising. This man is here on official business. You're out of line. But Chad stepped forward. We received a tip, he lied. There's concern he's impersonating a federal contractor. We can't take any chances. Malcolm stood slowly, deliberately. You're detaining me? On what grounds? The first officer moved in, pulling out handcuffs. For your safety and ours, sir. We need to escort you from the building while we verify your identity and search your belongings. Director, Malcolm said firmly, looking at Langston. This is a mistake. Langston looked outraged but stunned into silence, unsure how to override uniformed officers. Rick grabbed the briefcase. We'll handle this now. Malcolm was cuffed in front of the entire executive board, their eyes wide with disbelief. The cameras in the hallway caught every angle. The calm, professional man being marched out like a criminal. The damage, however, had already been done. By the time he stepped out of the building, his name had started trending online. The video of him being escorted out in cuffs viewed over 80,000 times and climbing fast. Local news affiliates had already picked up the clip, and hashtags like #BriefcaseJustice and #BankingWhileBlack flooded comment sections with disbelief, anger, and calls for accountability. But Malcolm wasn't concerned with social media or reputation in that moment. He was focused on resolution, clarity, and, above all, truth. He returned to the bank less than an hour later, with Langston himself waiting outside to escort him through the same glass doors from which he'd been paraded like a criminal. Langston, clearly shaken and apologetic, offered a dozen variations of "I'm so sorry," and "I didn't know they'd act like that," but Malcolm said little. His silence wasn't passive. It was sharpened by a sense of purpose that burned quietly beneath his composed exterior. As they entered, the lobby was noticeably quieter, tension still clinging to the air like humidity before storm. The same customers from earlier had either returned or never left, and the staff behind the counters looked up with a blend of curiosity and discomfort, each of them now aware, if not directly complicit. Rick Carson was standing near the security desk, arms crossed, his face a hardened mask of defensiveness and disdain. He didn't look at Langston. He didn't nod at Malcolm. Instead, as the 2 men passed, Rick scoffed under his breath, just loud enough for it to land like a stone hitting pavement. "You don't look like someone who has an account here," he muttered. Langston froze mid-step, turning slowly, his eyes narrowing. Malcolm didn't break stride. He merely glanced sideways at Rick and said evenly, "That's exactly why I'm here." Chad Benson appeared from a side hallway, his phone in one hand and a fake smile curling on his lips. "Wow, look who's back," he said, voice dripping with condescension. "That didn't take long. I thought you'd be filing a lawsuit or something." "Working on it," Malcolm replied, not stopping. Chad fell into step beside him, his voice lowering but thick with contempt. "You know, this bank isn't meant for people like you," he said, tone quiet but deliberate. "We serve a certain clientele, people with history, pedigree, financial presence. You walk in here with your smug attitude, flash a briefcase, and expect us to roll out the red carpet." Malcolm stopped walking, causing Langston to nearly bump into him. He turned to face Chad fully now, his expression unreadable but no longer patient. "People like me," he echoed, voice barely above a whisper but laced with steel. "You mean black? Or successful? Or both?" Chad tilted his head with a smug grin. "You said it, not me." For a beat, no one spoke. Then Malcolm stepped in, just close enough to make Chad shift uncomfortably but not enough to break decorum. "Let me explain something to you," he said. "You have no idea who I am, what I've done, or what power I hold in this exact building. But what you've made abundantly clear is that this branch operates on prejudice, not protocol. Your behavior and Rick's will have consequences, not because I demand revenge, but because I demand accountability." Chad laughed, too loudly, more for the nearby staff than Malcolm. "Big words. You sure you don't want to write them down first?" Rick, emboldened by Chad's mockery, stepped forward again. "This guy walks in acting like a big shot, expects us to bow. I did my job. I stopped a threat. Not my fault if it made him uncomfortable." "You didn't stop a threat," Langston snapped, finally raising his voice. "You created one. Out of nothing. You embarrassed this institution, violated protocol, and profiled a man who had every right to be here." "We followed instincts," Chad shot back. "You brought a stranger in without notifying security. That's a breakdown in communication, not discrimination." Malcolm turned to Langston. "Director, I think it's time we proceed with the meeting we were supposed to finish an hour ago. I've wasted enough time proving I belong in your building." Langston nodded quickly, throwing a hard glance toward Rick and Chad. "You're right. Let's go." As they walked toward the elevators again, Malcolm overheard Rick mumble to Chad, "He's just trying to play the race card. That's all they ever do when they don't get what they want." The word stung, not because they were surprising, but because they were expected. That's what made them so venomous. That's what made them so dangerous. Inside the elevator, Malcolm didn't speak. He stared at the metal doors, his reflection ghosted in the polished surface. Langston broke the silence. "They'll face consequences," he said quietly. "I promise you that." Malcolm's eyes flicked up to meet his in the mirror. "Promises don't fix patterns," he replied. "But action does." As they reached the top floor, Malcolm's mind was already shifting, already calculating the next step. Because this wasn't just about an insult or a confrontation. It was about the entire structure that allowed people like Rick and Chad to thrive. Though Langston had escorted him back in, the room itself remained divided, with half the executive staff still unsure whether they should be listening to this man or waiting for an apology from him. Malcolm, ever composed, returned to the long glass conference table where his briefcase had been placed after being confiscated during his wrongful detainment. An officer had returned it quietly, not looking Malcolm in the eye, clearly briefed on the mistake, but not brave enough to own it. Malcolm didn't say a word as he opened the case. There was no fanfare, no dramatic pause, no smug smile, only quiet authority. The polished latches clicked open with surgical precision, and he gently lifted the lid. The air seemed to still as the contents were revealed. No wires, no devices, no concealed threats. Only paperwork. Neatly arranged files, each stamped with Hamilton Central Bank's official seal, each page enclosed in clear sleeves, immaculately presented. The documents bore the unmistakable headers in bold. Termination Notice, Executive Division. The room fell into silence as Malcolm removed one file and slid it across the table toward Langston, then another toward a woman seated at the end of the conference table, and a third toward the Deputy Director of Compliance. Each packet was identical in structure, but tailored in content, with names, dates, findings, and legal justifications for termination clearly listed. Langston's hands hovered over the document for a moment before he opened it. His eyes moved slowly, scanning the contents, then widening. He read the name at the top, one that triggered a ripple across the table: Chad Benson. The notice was clear, its language irrefutable. It cited repeated reports of discriminatory behavior, 3 unresolved complaints from staff over the past 16 months, and a recent recorded incident involving abuse of authority. The source of that recording was not listed, but the implications were clear. Langston exhaled, a mix of disbelief and vindication. Malcolm turned toward the others in the room, his voice steady and controlled. "These documents are not suggestions. They are the outcome of a 6-month investigation conducted by Harris and Thorne, under contract with your board of directors. I was assigned as the lead investigator after this branch came under scrutiny for repeated ethics violations and discriminatory hiring practices. You weren't notified of the audit to ensure integrity and impartiality. I was instructed to arrive unannounced with the findings, to observe firsthand how internal culture would respond to an unfamiliar authority. What I experienced today confirmed the core issue. One of the senior advisors, a man named Carlyle, frowned and leaned forward. You're saying this entire visit was a test? Malcolm met his gaze. A test, a delivery, and a final review. My briefing included conducting a covert in-person assessment of your team's behavior toward a perceived outsider. The fact that I was detained, humiliated, and accused of being a threat, despite presenting credentials and having a scheduled meeting, was exactly the kind of behavior the board suspected existed here. Another executive, a woman named Louise from Legal Affairs, began to skim her copy of the termination notice. She didn't speak, but her lips pressed into a thin line as she read the cited violations. The sound of papers shifting across the table replaced words for the next minute. Malcolm remained standing. He did not sit. He watched. He waited. Chad entered the room just then, unaware of what had just unfolded. His casual, overconfident posture vanished when he saw the documents being read. "What's this?" he asked, scanning the table. "You having a meeting without me?" "You're the subject of the meeting," Langston replied coldly. Chad laughed, a dry sound that cracked in his throat. "What?" Malcolm stepped forward and placed a copy of the termination packet directly in front of him. "I believe you'll want to read this in full before speaking again." Chad picked it up and scoffed. "This is a joke." "It isn't," Langston said, voice firm. "And it's signed by the chair of the board." Rick, who had remained just outside the conference room, was suddenly aware of the glances being thrown in his direction. He stepped back as if hoping to disappear from view, but Malcolm didn't allow that. "There's a file in here for you too," Malcolm said, voice ringing through the glass walls. "Though yours involves the regional security director. An internal review has already begun regarding your use of force, racial profiling, and protocol violations. You'll be placed on leave pending investigation." Rick didn't respond. He didn't move. His mouth opened slightly, but no words formed. A nearby HR representative stood and asked, "Are these recommendations or final actions?" Malcolm answered without pause. "They are final. The board has approved the terminations. Any further disputes must be directed to the arbitration clause outlined in your contracts. I suggest you read those closely." The weight of accountability had finally entered the room, and it pressed down hard. Langston remained frozen in his chair, his face stern, unreadable. Not a flicker of sympathy spared for the men now squirming in plain view. Rick stood near the doorway, arms crossed tightly, fingers twitching against his sleeves. His eyes darted from face to face, searching desperately for someone, anyone, who might be on his side. Chad, still holding the document Malcolm had handed him, scanned the pages with shallow, panicked breaths, his confidence rapidly collapsing under the sheer volume of what was laid out. Neither man spoke at first. No one did, and the silence screamed louder than any accusation. Finally, Rick cleared his throat, breaking the unbearable stillness. "Look, this is obviously some kind of misunderstanding," he said, forcing a chuckle that sounded like gravel in his throat. "I mean, sure, maybe I overreacted a bit earlier today, but it was about safety. My job is to protect this building. That's what I was doing. I didn't know who he was." He gestured clumsily toward Malcolm without meeting his eyes. "I didn't know what was in the briefcase. You saw the footage. He wouldn't let me inspect it properly." Malcolm remained still, his expression neutral, offering Rick nothing. Langston turned his gaze slowly toward Rick, still silent, still stone-faced. The absence of words from the director cut deeper than any reprimand. Rick swallowed hard and continued, voice rising slightly with false bravado. "So what? I followed instinct. That's not a crime. There's no manual for every situation. He could have been anybody. You know the climate we're in. It's better to act than regret later. I was trying to protect the bank." "From me?" Malcolm asked quietly, the first words he'd spoken since the documents were opened. Rick didn't answer. The rhetorical weight of the question hung in the air, undeniable. Chad finally pushed his chair back and stood, attempting to regain control. "Okay, let's slow down here," he said, trying to rally his composure. "Yes, there were mistakes made. But these documents? Termination? That's excessive. You don't throw away years of service over one incident. It's not one incident, Louise from legal said flatly, breaking her silence for the first time. She flipped through the report again. You've had 3 previous complaints for racial insensitivity, and you retaliated against a junior analyst who reported you last quarter. That's not speculation, Chad. That's documented. You signed the HR report yourself. Chad's face turned a shade paler. Those reports were exaggerated. People say things when they're emotional. I never did anything illegal. Malcolm tilted his head slightly. Illegality isn't the threshold for termination. Ethical violations, repeated misconduct, and systemic bias are more than enough, especially when you're in a position of leadership. You weren't just unprofessional, Chad. You were reckless. And worse, you were emboldened by a system that allowed it. Chad scoffed, though it lacked conviction. So this is a witch hunt? I'm the scapegoat now. Langston finally spoke, his voice low but razor sharp. You're not a scapegoat. You're a symptom of a culture that this board is no longer willing to tolerate. We brought in outside counsel to uncover exactly this, and they did. You don't get to spin this now that you've been caught. Chad turned to Langston, disbelief twisting his features. You're really going to throw me under the bus? After everything I've done for this place? Langston's stare did not waver. What you've done is exactly why we're here. Rick stepped forward, desperate now. And what about me? I've never had complaints on record. I followed my gut. Isn't that what we're supposed to do when something feels wrong? Malcolm's voice was calm but cutting. You followed your bias, not your training. You ignored protocol and made assumptions based on how I looked. That's not security. That's profiling. And you didn't just follow your gut. You escalated, humiliated, and endangered a client representative without cause. There are consequences for that. Another board member, a woman in a Navy suit, spoke next. You initiated a partial evacuation. You involved law enforcement. You caused a PR incident that's already spreading online. And now you're trying to rationalize it as instinct. Rick stammered. I was doing my job. No, Langston said, with finality. You were doing damage. Silence again. But this time it was different. Final. There was no one left to argue. No room left to spin. The room had moved beyond denial into the cold reckoning of reality. The only sound was the faint hum of the ventilation system and the occasional rustle of paper as board members continued to review the findings, reinforcing everything that had just been said. Chad sat back down slowly, the weight of his failures finally settling in. Rick, red-faced and stiff, looked like a man cornered not by his enemies, but by the truth. Malcolm looked at neither of them. His gaze stayed on Langston, and the director gave him a subtle nod, acknowledgement, maybe even a silent apology. Malcolm Harris remained seated, composed, sharp-eyed, and entirely in control of the atmosphere, not by force or theatrics, but by the undeniable authority of facts. Across the table, Rick's fingers curled into anxious fists at his sides, while Chad's shoulders sagged slightly, as though the realization of his undoing had finally begun to set in. The board members sat with their documents now clutched like verdicts, expressions hardened by clarity. Then, Director Langston stood. The motion was unhurried, deliberate, and final. His chair rolled back slightly as he placed both palms flat on the polished wood surface, leaned forward, and let his gaze move slowly across every face in the room. When he spoke, his voice carried not volume but weight, controlled, clear, and with the unmistakable tone of authority finally unchained. Enough, he said simply, yet it echoed like a gavel strike. What we've witnessed today goes far beyond a personnel issue. It is not an isolated misunderstanding or a regrettable oversight. It is a systemic breach of the ethics we claim to uphold. And it is now a public disgrace. His eyes locked on Rick first, who stiffened under the scrutiny. You didn't act in defense of this institution, Mr. Carson. You acted out of prejudice. You didn't follow security protocol. You followed an internal bias that you've likely never had to examine until today. You humiliated a guest with verified credentials, detained him unlawfully, involved law enforcement under false pretenses, and weaponized your uniform to satisfy suspicion rooted in personal assumption, not evidence. Rick opened his mouth to interrupt, but Langston raised a hand, not as a request, but as a command, and Rick fell silent. You will be suspended immediately, without pay, pending a formal investigation by our Regional Ethics Compliance Team and an independent oversight committee. You will surrender your badge and credentials by the end of the day. Rick's eyes widened. I've worked here 17 years, he said in a strained voice. You've never been held accountable. Langston cut in, his tone steely. But that changes today. He turned to Chad next, and if his stare toward Rick had been cold, this one was glacial. As for you, Mr. Benson, you have not only violated the standards of managerial conduct, but embarrassed this institution in front of its board, its staff, and now its clients. Your history of documented complaints, combined with your behavior today, paints a pattern of intolerance, entitlement, and abuse of position. You were given warnings. You were given training. You were given chances. You chose arrogance. Chad clenched his jaw but remained silent, eyes flickering toward the exit like a man preparing for flight but realizing escape was no longer an option. Effective immediately, Langston continued, you are suspended from all duties. Your access to internal systems is revoked. You will not return to this building until your review is complete. HR will meet you downstairs to begin your exit process. If you refuse to comply, you will be terminated outright, without severance, and without appeal. The room was frozen in the quiet aftermath of the announcement, the only sound being the subtle whir of the ceiling vent overhead and the distant shuffle of someone outside the glass walls. But it wasn't over. Langston shifted his attention back to the rest of the board, standing straighter now, no longer just a director, but a man reclaiming command of a sinking ship. To every board member here, consider this a mirror held up to our leadership. We allowed this culture to ferment. We allowed these people to thrive unchecked. The reports Malcolm and his firm delivered should never have been necessary. They only confirm what we already should have seen and stopped ourselves. No one dared object. Some nodded slightly. Others looked away, the sting of guilt settling into their posture. Langston stepped back from the table, drawing a quiet breath. Then, turning toward Malcolm, he added, Mr. Harris, you've conducted yourself with professionalism, restraint, and integrity despite being subjected to conduct that was, frankly, inexcusable. On behalf of Hamilton Central Bank, I apologize. Not as a formality, but as a recognition of failure. You were brought here to deliver an assessment, and what you've revealed is not just misconduct, it's betrayal. Malcolm said nothing immediately. He let the words settle. He looked around the room, letting the new silence affirm what Langston had finally given voice to, the acknowledgement that truth was no longer optional, and that injustice would no longer be buried under bureaucracy. Langston cleared his throat once more and made the final statement that truly shifted the power dynamic for good. Mr. Harris will remain on site for the remainder of the day with full access to executive floors and staff. His authority, under contract with the board, supersedes mine for all internal audit actions. He will lead the debriefs. He will provide final recommendations, and his decisions will be upheld. The air tightened again, not from discomfort, but from the shock of hierarchy being restructured in real time. Malcolm, the man profiled and humiliated only hours ago, now held the keys to the kingdom, by merit, by law, and by necessity. Chad sat like stone, face unreadable. Rick looked stunned, the anger drained from his expression, replaced with quiet disbelief. Several board members turned their chairs slightly toward Malcolm, a silent show of respect, or perhaps fear. Malcolm finally spoke, his voice even and direct. Thank you, Director Langston. My team and I will proceed as contracted. This process will continue efficiently and without compromise. He hadn't raised his voice or pounded his fist on the table. The power had been given to him because it was earned, through precision, through restraint, and most importantly, through proof. His briefcase, once labeled suspicious and criminal, now sat open on the table, its documents meticulously organized. each one a loaded ledger of accountability. With Langston's authority backing his mandate and the board no longer obstructing his presence, Malcolm began the process of auditing not just the systems, but the people, the voices that had long been silenced or dismissed. The interviews started that afternoon, conducted in the adjoining conference room with a witness from HR and one board member present at all times. Malcolm requested this structure not only to ensure transparency, but to protect the employees who were finally stepping forward after months, and in some cases, years of suppression. The first to enter was Yvette Moreno, a soft-spoken teller who'd worked at the bank for 6 years. She sat nervously at the edge of her chair, hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together in her lap. Malcolm offered her a warm but professional smile, introduced himself again, and began gently. "Ms. Moreno, thank you for your time. I want you to understand that this is a protected conversation. You're under no obligation to share anything that makes you uncomfortable, and nothing you say here will be used against you in any way." Yvette nodded slowly. Her voice, when it came, was quiet. "I didn't think anyone would ever ask. Not seriously anyway." For the next 20 minutes, she recounted multiple incidents involving Chad. How he made comments about her accent during a staff meeting. How he questioned whether she was legal during a company lunch. How he denied her promotion twice without giving any written explanation, even though her performance reviews were exemplary. "I filed complaints," she said, her eyes starting to fill. "But I never got follow-ups. After a while, I just stopped trying." Malcolm asked thoughtful, direct questions, always careful not to lead or push. When she finished, she looked at him like someone who had finally exhaled after holding their breath for too long. "Thank you for telling me," he said sincerely. "Your experience matters, and it's part of the official record now. What you've done today is important." Yvette left the room in tears, but they were different than the kind she cried before. Next came Marcus Kim, an IT technician who had barely spoken above a whisper during previous staff meetings. Today, he walked into the room with a manila folder tucked under his arm and a look of restrained fury behind his glasses. "I kept records," he said, sliding a folder across the table to Malcolm. Inside were screenshots, email threads, and timestamp logs, documentation of direct orders from Chad to delete certain internal messages and security warnings, specifically those related to Rick's security reports. Some of those flagged complaints contained racial profiling notes. Chad had instructed him to erase them, to mark them as resolved even though no investigation had been conducted. "He told me if I didn't do it, he'd frame it as an insubordination issue," Marcus said flatly. "And I got family to take care of. I couldn't lose my job." Malcolm flipped through the evidence methodically, then nodded. "You won't lose your job, Mr. Kim. Not for doing the right thing. What you've provided here is critical." Word began to spread throughout the building that the audit wasn't just real, it was working. That the man in the conference room was not another corporate figurehead conducting damage control, but someone listening, someone documenting, someone delivering. More employees began to come forward. Sandra Ellis from Compliance described how Chad had ignored her recommendations on multiple occasions and even removed her from key meetings after she raised red flags on their branch's hiring patterns. "He called me a diversity quota when he thought I couldn't hear him," she whispered, eyes darting toward the door. "I should have reported it, but HR is his friend, was his friend." An intern named Jordan, barely 23, described how Rick had cornered him in the break room during his second week and told him, "If you want to survive here, stay out of things that don't concern you." Jordan had been helping an elderly black client fill out paperwork at the time. "I just wanted to help her," he said. She was confused and scared. He said I was wasting time on people who wouldn't bring real money to the bank. Each testimony added a new layer to the mountain of evidence Malcolm was compiling, and each person who entered the room left lighter, as if shedding a weight they hadn't realized they carried. Then came the most gut-wrenching testimony of the day. Olivia Grant, a mid-level operations manager with 8 years at the bank and a spotless reputation, walked in with tears already in her eyes. She sat down, nodded that she was ready, and began. "I should have said something last year," she said. I saw what Rick did to a man who came in for a business loan. The way he treated him, the way he flagged him for aggressive behavior just because he asked about interest rates, it was wrong. And I wrote a memo about it. I sent it to Chad. 2 days later, he called me into his office and said I had a compliance attitude problem. He told me if I kept digging into things that weren't mine to handle, I'd find myself transferred to the most invisible corner of this company. Or worse. She covered her mouth, visibly shaking. And I believed him, so I stopped. And I've hated myself ever since. Malcolm remained composed, but his voice softened. You did what you thought you had to do to survive. No one blames you for that. But today, you chose truth. That matters more. Olivia nodded, breaking into silent sobs. HR escorted her out gently, promising follow-up support. As the day wore on, the number of interviews continued to grow. Every voice came with a story, and every story added to the unmistakable truth. Rick and Chad were not anomalies. They were gatekeepers of a culture built on fear. The numbers weren't just adding up, they were painting a damning portrait of an institution that had grown comfortable with oppression disguised as order. Behind every quiet voice that had come forward during the first wave of interviews, there was a history of systemic failure. But it was late that afternoon when the audit reached a new level of magnitude. The door to the interview room opened, and in stepped a man who Malcolm had seen only once before, during a meeting months ago with the Internal Compliance Committee. His name was Peter Liu, a systems analyst in the bank's digital compliance unit. He wasn't particularly senior, nor was he someone who drew attention, but there was something about the way he entered, measured, steady, determined, that told Malcolm this conversation was going to be different. Peter sat down, declined water, and immediately slid a small portable hard drive across the table. "I've been waiting for this," he said. "I didn't know if it would ever happen, but when I heard you were leading this, I knew it was time." Malcolm looked at the drive, then back to Peter. "What's on it?" "Recordings," Peter said, "of Rick and Chad. Not just from this week, from months ago, maybe more. I work with internal systems, which includes managing and securing the conference room's smartboard and meeting software. What most of them didn't know is that some of the rooms defaulted to auto record when the system was left active. They never wiped the archives, and I didn't delete them." Malcolm felt his pulse quicken, but his face remained calm. "You're telling me you have audio or video proof?" Peter nodded. "Both. At least 5 clips. Some are short, just minutes. But one of them is a full recording of a closed-door meeting between Chad, Rick, and a few senior staff. The topic was hiring diversity, or rather, how to avoid it without making it look like discrimination. They joked about it, laughed, called it optics management." He paused, jaw tightening. "It made me sick." Malcolm carefully took the drive, placing it on the table like a priceless artifact. "Why didn't you bring this forward sooner?" Peter hesitated, then answered with brutal honesty. "Because I was afraid. Because I have a mortgage, a sick parent, and no illusions about what happens to people who speak up in places like this. But the moment you were arrested for carrying that briefcase, something about that broke whatever excuse I had left. You deserve better. Everyone here does." Malcolm gave a slow nod. "You're not the only one who's been scared into silence. But what you've done now, that's bravery." Peter gave a tight smile, the kind of expression that held both relief and anxiety. "Please make it count." "I will," Malcolm said. "You have my word." Peter left without another word, and the moment the door closed, Malcolm turned to his audit assistant, who immediately began processing the drive. Within minutes, they were watching the first clip, grainy video, muffled audio, but clear enough. Chad's voice came through first, unmistakable even under the cheap ceiling mic. "We don't need to hire people just to meet some woke quota. If they want us to look diverse, we can rotate who works the front desk every week." Problem solved. Laughter followed. Rick's voice came next. "And if anyone complains, just call it a safety concern. Hell, that works every time." More laughter. Then another voice, someone Malcolm hadn't identified yet, joined in with a comment that chilled the room. "Let HR worry about the paperwork. We'll keep the lobby clean." The implications were undeniable. This wasn't implicit bias or plausible deniability. This was calculated discrimination, joked about like it was part of the business plan. Malcolm sat back in his chair, his jaw tight, his fingers steepled in front of his mouth. He didn't speak as the clips played on. Another clip captured Rick bragging about how he'd shut down a guy just by looking at him sideways. A different recording had Chad complaining that diversity hires always cry racism when they can't keep up. It was grotesque, but it was gold, undeniable, unspinnable, unforgivable. By the time they had gone through all the files, Malcolm had compiled timestamps, direct quotes, and a summarized transcript ready for distribution. He notified Director Langston, who arrived within 20 minutes and listened to the recordings with his face growing grayer by the second. When the last clip ended, Langston remained seated, unmoving, hands folded on the table. "These are nuclear," he said finally. "There's no walking this back." "That's the point," Malcolm replied. "We don't walk it back. We walk through it. The institution can either bury its head or use this moment to rebuild from scratch. But it can't do both." Langston nodded. "Do what you have to do." That evening, Malcolm drafted a preliminary findings summary, attaching select audio clips and quotes with context, and prepared it for the board. At the same time, legal and HR initiated emergency reviews of all staff who had been in the recorded meeting. Peter's identity was kept confidential, but his evidence became the backbone of a pending report to the Corporate Oversight Committee. The next morning began not with an internal memo or a board meeting, but with chaos swelling just outside the bank's front doors. By 7 a.m., a line of news vans had formed along the curb outside Hamilton Central Bank's downtown headquarters, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, reporters setting up live broadcasts under the cloudy August sky. Just behind the media, a crowd of angry protesters began to form, some holding handmade signs, others dressed in office, where as if they had come straight from work to demand justice. By 8 a.m., the chants had started. By 8:15, the video had been shared more than 3 million times. The footage that had leaked wasn't just one clip. It was an edited compilation of the most damning segments pulled from the recordings Peter had provided, paired with a few anonymous staff testimonials read aloud by voice actors. It was crisp, unforgiving, and brutal. Rick's smug declaration about shutting someone down just by looking at him sideways, and Chad's mockery of diversity protocols had already become soundbites for morning shows across the country. Malcolm Harris hadn't leaked the footage himself, but someone in the upper audit team, likely tired of internal containment attempts, had forwarded it to a journalist with integrity and a reputation for reporting unfiltered truths. Within hours, the story became national. Social media exploded. Prominent public figures weighed in. Celebrities tweeted #Justice for Malcolm, while economic pundits dissected the bank's crumbling PR strategy. Civil rights leaders condemned the institution's failure to address years of discrimination. And in perhaps the most devastating blow to Hamilton's reputation, 3 of their biggest corporate clients announced immediate suspension of partnerships pending the outcome of the internal investigation. Investors were already pulling out. By mid-morning, Hamilton Central Bank's stock had dropped 11%. Inside the bank, upper management scrambled to contain the firestorm. The president of the bank's Eastern Division arrived unannounced and immediately summoned Langston and the rest of the board to a closed-door emergency meeting. The mood was apocalyptic. Phones buzzed with nonstop alerts. PR consultants huddled in corners, whispering frantically. Staff moved through the halls like ghosts, unsure whether to act like it was a normal day or admit they were working inside a collapsing institution. Malcolm remained composed. He had anticipated this moment, even if he hadn't orchestrated it. The truth, once it escaped its boundaries, had its own momentum, and there was no putting it back. When the emergency meeting began, Malcolm was invited to attend not just as a consultant, but as the anchor of credibility the institution now desperately needed. He entered the room with a full report in hand, dressed in the same crisp navy suit he had worn on his first day there, when he'd been profiled, detained, and humiliated. Now, the same people who had doubted or dismissed him looked to him as the person who could salvage what was left. Langston opened the meeting with tired eyes and a voice hardened by crisis. The video is everywhere. Clients are furious. Staff morale is in free fall. Our legal counsel is warning us to prepare for class action filings. We are officially in collapse mode. The room remained silent. No one interrupted. He gestured to Malcolm. "Mr. Harris has the floor." Malcolm didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice or scold anyone. He simply handed out copies of the executive summary, then spoke with the same clarity that had become his signature since the audit began. The damage to this bank was not caused by the video. The video revealed the damage that already existed. Years of unchecked discrimination, unethical management practices, and silencing of internal complaints brought us here. The audit was never the crisis. The audit exposed the crisis. He let that sentence hang in the air. Then he opened his folder. The whistleblower who provided the recordings remains confidential, but has authorized us to submit them as evidence to corporate oversight. In addition, we now have sworn statements from over 30 employees citing similar behavior from Rick Carson and Chad Benson, including multiple reports suppressed by internal HR. The problem was not isolated to two individuals. It was a cultural rot allowed to fester under the guise of protocol and seniority. A woman from legal raised her hand. "We've already received cease and desist threats from Benson's attorney. He's claiming defamation." "He can claim whatever he wants," Malcolm replied calmly. "But we have audio, documentation, and contractual grounds for termination with cause. The bigger risk is doing nothing." The bank president, a seasoned executive with graying temples and piercing eyes, leaned forward. "What's your recommendation?" Malcolm didn't flinch. "A full-scale transparency initiative. Immediate termination of any employee connected to the cover-ups. Public acknowledgement of institutional failure. And a restorative justice strategy that involves the affected employees in rebuilding trust. If you don't own this, the public will define you by it. And they already are." Langston nodded slowly. "I support it." One by one, the board members agreed. Not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. Outside, the chants grew louder. Accountability now. Hamilton must fall. No more silence. Inside, Malcolm outlined the next steps. Press conference by noon. Internal statement by end of day. Launch of an ethics review committee led by an independent firm. Support services made available to employees who had come forward. Public acknowledgement of those who had spoken truth to power. He didn't do it for applause. He did it because it was the right thing. Around 11, Malcolm walked out of the building to address the crowd. The media swarmed. Protesters quieted as he stepped to the podium hastily erected by a local news outlet. The hashtag Justice in a Briefcase surged past 2 million mentions before the hour was over, propelled by influencers, activists, and ordinary citizens who recognized not only the injustice in Malcolm Harris's story, but the terrifying familiarity of it. The image that circulated most widely showed Malcolm standing in front of the podium earlier that morning, head held high, briefcase at his side, while news crews swarmed around him. Someone had captioned it. He came with papers. They gave him handcuffs. He gave them truth. The post hit a nerve. The comment section exploded. And within an hour, the story had been shared by everyone from civil rights organizations to celebrities to financial watchdog groups. Major outlets ran op-eds with titles like Profiling in the Suit and Tie Era, and The Briefcase that brought a bank to its knees. The power of symbolism fused with irrefutable evidence had created a firestorm no PR team could douse. On the bank's official Instagram page, every post from the past 6 months, photos of smiling employees, cheesy motivational quotes, diversity hiring announcements, was now buried under thousands of angry comments. "Don't preach about inclusion while you jail the man who came to fix your mess," one follower wrote. Another user replied, "Your values end at the lobby doors." The comment sections weren't just angry, they were surgical. Screenshots of Rick and Chad's profiles on LinkedIn were being posted, scrutinized, and debated. Posts they had made in the past, some tone-deaf, some outright offensive, were now resurfacing and dissected in threads that ran hundreds of comments deep. Attempts by the bank's social media team to respond with neutral statements were instantly ratioed. One tweet, which read, "We are aware of the recent incident and are working to resolve the matter internally," was met with replies like, "The world is watching." You don't get to resolve injustice quietly. By the end of the day, an open letter from over 60 social justice organizations was circulating, calling for not just the termination of Rick and Chad, but criminal investigations into their actions. The letter demanded that the district attorney review Rick's conduct under wrongful detainment statutes, and that Chad be investigated for obstruction of internal compliance protocols. At the same time, multiple petitions surged across platforms like Change.org, the largest titled "Prosecute Hamilton's Racist Executives," which crossed 500,000 signatures in just under 4 hours. Celebrities began adding their voices. A-list actors, best-selling authors, musicians, and athletes used their platforms to shine more light on the story. A prominent tech billionaire tweeted, "This man walked in with termination notices and was treated like a criminal. The real danger was never him. It was the silence that protected the abusers." That tweet alone had over 300,000 likes and was shared by news networks globally. In parallel, the financial sector braced for turbulence. Hamilton Central Bank's competitors issued subtle but noticeable statements distancing themselves from discriminatory business practices. A multinational corporation publicly announced it had canceled a 7-figure deal with Hamilton due to concerns over ethics and integrity. Other companies followed suit. In total, over $200 million in potential business evaporated by the close of the trading day. Malcolm, meanwhile, remained focused. He had no time to celebrate virality or bask in vindication. While social media boiled over with anger and support, he was still inside the building, finalizing the legal preparation of all audit materials to be submitted to the Office of Corporate Compliance. His face, now seen on nearly every screen in the country, did not reflect exhaustion. It reflected resolve. He worked through lunch, barely pausing to sip from a bottle of water between debriefings. By early afternoon, he had received confirmation that the whistleblower's footage had been archived by several legal bodies and secured in protected cloud servers. The audit was now legally bulletproof. Still, he knew public pressure was only one part of the equation. Change had to be institutionalized. Inside the HR offices, affected employees were already being contacted and offered resources, legal, psychological, and financial, to support them through the transition. Those who had spoken up during the audit were offered protection from retaliation under a newly activated whistleblower clause that had long sat dormant in the employee handbook. The culture at Hamilton was unraveling, and in its place, the framework of accountability was finally being constructed. But outside, the public wanted more. They wanted names. They wanted charges. They wanted handcuffs for the people who had built careers out of silence and control. At 2:35 p.m., a press release from the district attorney's office confirmed that an official inquiry had begun into the actions of Rick Carson and Chad Benson. The statement cited public interest, the whistleblower's evidence, and a formal request submitted by Malcolm Harris's legal team. The crowd outside erupted in cheers when the news broke. Reporters sprinted across the sidewalk to get reaction statements. Protesters chanted louder, their voices echoing off the stone walls of the bank. "Not just fired, make them answer." The bank's interim spokesperson tried to hold a press conference shortly after, but it was a disaster. She fumbled through prepared remarks, dodged key questions, and refused to say whether charges would be supported by the institution. Her failure only inflamed the backlash. Malcolm watched from a conference room window, expression unchanged, knowing the public's demand for justice was now aligned with the work he'd already been doing in silence. By 4 p.m., Hamilton's board voted unanimously to release a joint statement publicly supporting the district attorney's inquiry and distancing themselves from Rick and Chad's actions. The interview had been arranged in haste by a sympathetic media executive who saw in Rick not a liability, but a ratings opportunity. The Chosen Network, a conservative outlet known for its inflammatory takes and historical minimization of racial controversies, framed the exclusive as a chance for the other side of the story to be heard. Rick didn't hesitate. He arrived in a blazer that still bore his bank-issued security pin, though it was now purely ornamental, and sat under studio lights with a practiced frown that blended regret with indignation. The interviewer, a polished anchor with a reputation for veiled dog whistles, opened the segment by stating, "Tonight, we hear from the man at the center of a media firestorm." Rick Carson, a security veteran, was suspended after what many say was a mischaracterized incident. Is this accountability or cancel culture gone too far? Rick took a breath, nodded solemnly, and began spinning. "I've been in law enforcement and corporate security for over 20 years, he said, hands clasped tightly. "My job is to keep people safe. That day, when Mr. Harris walked in, I had no idea who he was. He had a sealed briefcase. He refused to let me inspect it. In a time when threats can come from anywhere, I followed the procedures I was trained on. Nothing more, nothing less." He paused dramatically. "Now I'm being called a racist and facing national humiliation for doing my job." The interviewer offered a sympathetic frown. "Do you believe race had anything to do with your decision?" Rick looked directly into the camera. "Absolutely not. I don't see color. I see behavior." And his behavior that day was evasive, agitated. "I was protecting the building, and now I'm the villain." What Rick failed to anticipate was the world beyond the studio, real-time, unfiltered, and hungry for truth. As soon as the segment aired, clips of the interview flooded social media, and within minutes, fact-checkers across multiple platforms began dismantling his narrative piece by piece. Footage from the bank's security cameras, already circulating online, clearly showed Malcolm Harris walking in calmly, presenting his ID without hesitation, never raising his voice, never resisting. The briefcase had been sealed because it contained official documents, and Malcolm had stated as much twice on camera. Every element of Rick's version unraveled under scrutiny. The interviewer's softball questions, designed to humanize Rick, were clipped and captioned into memes. One went viral with the quote, "I don't see color, just locked briefcases and the people I think shouldn't carry them." The backlash was instant. Even viewers of the conservative network flooded the comments, many unable to reconcile Rick's claims with the actual footage. Prominent lawyers and journalists posted side-by-side comparisons. Rick's interview versus real-time evidence. The consensus was brutal. Rick had lied. Worse, he had used a national platform to double down on falsehoods that had already been disproven. Malcolm, upon seeing the interview, didn't respond publicly. He didn't have to. The truth was doing all the work. Instead, he forwarded the interview link to the legal team working with the district attorney, noting, "This is not just spin. This is obstruction." The DA's office acknowledged receipt and confirmed it would be included in the investigative materials. Meanwhile, civil rights groups issued statements condemning Rick's attempt to distort the narrative. One op-ed from a well-known activist read, "This is a textbook case of power attempting to rewrite history in real time." Carson wasn't canceled, he was exposed. That same day, a coalition of former Hamilton employees, emboldened by Malcolm's audit and the public support, held a press conference of their own. Several of them spoke candidly about Rick's long history of racial profiling, how he often used phrases like gut instinct as justification for targeting black and brown clients, and how complaints against him were routinely ignored or rerouted. One former branch manager revealed that she'd once been told by Chad Benson to let Rick do his thing. It keeps the lobby in order. The press conference was streamed live and widely viewed, and it shattered whatever illusion Rick had tried to create in the studio. The next blow came from within Rick's own circles. A retired colleague who had worked with him years earlier posted a video on YouTube recalling how Rick had once joked about scaring the street out of people the moment they walk in. The video gained traction, spawning a new hashtag. #RickSaidIt. Memes, parodies, and satire followed. TikTok creators reenacted the interview using over-the-top dramatics and humor, drawing millions of views. One creator dressed in a suit, holding a toy briefcase, lip-synced Rick's claims, then cut to Malcolm's calm demeanor from the bank footage. Silent, poised, utterly contradictory to everything Rick had claimed. By evening, the media outlet that hosted the interview issued a carefully worded clarification, stating that while they provide a platform for diverse perspectives, they do not endorse or validate claims that contradict verifiable evidence. The damage was done. Rick's attempt to rewrite the narrative had backfired spectacularly, not just reinforcing public condemnation, but solidifying his place as a cautionary tale of what happens when the truth is no longer yours to control. At home, Rick found himself increasingly isolated. Friends stopped answering his calls. His attorney advised him to stay off social media. Neighbors avoided eye contact. His name, once associated with stability and trust inside the bank's hallways, had become shorthand for abuse of power. Meanwhile, Malcolm stayed silent. He knew the real consequences were still ahead. Instead, he secluded himself in a private residence far from the city and communicated only through his attorney, hoping that corporate walls and years of backroom loyalty would buffer him from the collapse. But Chad had underestimated both the speed and depth of exposure Malcolm's audit had triggered. As the evidence piled up and the public fury swelled into relentless pressure, an unlikely figure from within Chad's own camp stepped forward. A senior executive assistant named Valerie Clark, who had worked under Chad for 4 years, managing his schedule, drafting communications, and being privy to every meeting and memo that passed through his office. Valerie had been quiet during the early stages of the audit, observing, unsure, perhaps even afraid. But after witnessing Rick's failed media stunt and seeing the overwhelming tide of truth taking shape, she could no longer keep what she knew locked away. She approached Malcolm directly, bypassing internal channels, and handed over a USB drive that contained a damning collection of emails, memos, and voice notes, many of them saved by Valerie without Chad's knowledge. "I knew something like this would happen eventually," she said as she handed the device to Malcolm, her hands trembling slightly. "He's been controlling people with fear for years." It wasn't just racism. It was systemic silencing, retaliation, threats. And everyone let him do it because he made the bank money. Malcolm nodded solemnly. "Thank you, Ms. Clark. This changes everything." Within hours, the contents of the drive were reviewed, categorized, and verified. What emerged was the blueprint of a man who hadn't merely tolerated the culture of discrimination, but had engineered it. In one memo, Chad wrote to an HR director instructing them to slow-roll certain complaint investigations to avoid triggering quarterly diversity reviews. In another, he referred to an internal compliance officer as a DEI zombie and recommended that their reports be marked as inconclusive to protect executive optics. Perhaps most damaging was a series of voice memos, casual off-the-cuff recordings Chad had made while driving or pacing in his office, where he mocked minority hires, suggested coding black applicants as non-culturally aligned, and laughed about how easily complaints could be recycled or buried if phrased the right way. These weren't slips of the tongue. These were instructions, practices, and policies dressed in casual arrogance. Malcolm prepared a brief for the board titled Strategic Culture Suppression, the Chad Benson Files, and presented it during a high-level meeting scheduled that Friday morning. The room was tense, every board member having already seen the public's reaction to Rick's failed redemption, and knowing that Chad's name had now become synonymous with Hamilton's rot. Chad, still under suspension but not yet removed from the company's executive structure, was invited to attend. And to everyone's surprise, he showed up, dressed in a dark gray suit with a loosened tie and eyes that betrayed weeks of sleepless nights. Chad walked in with forced confidence, carrying a manila folder as though it could somehow protect him. He didn't speak as Malcolm began presenting the findings. Slide after slide revealed the damning language of his emails, the clear patterns of obstruction, and the voice memos that carried his unmistakable cadence, dripping with smug control. At first, Chad sat stiffly, staring at the table, hands folded. But as the evidence became impossible to deny, his composure began to crack. His breathing became audible. His grip on the folder tightened. He looked around the room and found no sympathy, just the blank, unreadable expressions of board members who now saw him not as a leader, but as a liability. Malcolm ended the presentation with a calm but forceful statement. "What this material reveals is not negligence. It's intent. Mr. Benson didn't allow a toxic culture. He constructed it. He enabled it. He enforced it. And he profited from it while employees suffered in silence. The room fell silent. Then, for the first time since the scandal began, Chad spoke. "This is a hit job," he snapped, standing abruptly. "You all loved my numbers for the last 5 years. You gave me awards, bonuses. The second there's a little heat, you turn on me." He pointed at Malcolm. "And this whole thing is performative. You want to dismantle a legacy built on results because you didn't like how the sausage was made." One board member leaned forward. "Chad, this isn't heat. It's accountability. And your legacy was built on suppression and prejudice." Chad laughed bitterly. "Please, you think I'm the only one who played this game? Every major exec in this building knew how it worked. I just didn't hide behind sanitized language." Another board member replied coldly, "Then you'll be the first to answer for it." Chad's face flushed red. He slammed the folder onto the table and leaned over, voice lower, sharper. "You can strip my title, my shares, my name off the door. But if you think sacrificing me is going to save this place, you're already dead." Malcolm, unmoved, looked him directly in the eye. "This was never about saving the building. It's about salvaging the people inside it." For a long moment, Chad just stood there, breathing heavily, jaw clenched. Then, with a suddenness that surprised no one, he turned, grabbed his folder, and stormed out of the room. The door slammed behind him, the sound echoing through the long corridor like the final thud of a fallen regime. That afternoon, a company-wide email went out. Chad Benson had officially resigned from his position, effective immediately. The statement was clinical, devoid of praise or ceremony. No golden parachute, no goodbye tour. Just a line in an inbox marking the end of a man who had once held unchecked power. In his absence, former victims sent messages of relief and cautious hope. Malcolm Harris, still operating out of the now transformed executive suite, coordinated directly with legal counsel and the district attorney's office, turning over every document, every recording, and every testimonial compiled throughout the audit. There were no gaps left to fill, no ambiguity to hide behind. The record was complete, and the law was ready to act. The first warrant was issued on a Monday morning, unsealed just after sunrise. Rick Carson, now disgraced and persona non grata across both corporate and personal networks, was officially charged with unlawful detainment, racial profiling, and falsification of a security report with intent to defame. Investigators had obtained proof that he had altered his incident report from the day of Malcolm's arrest, adding language after the fact to justify his actions, language that directly contradicted security footage and internal timestamps. At the same time, surveillance logs showed Rick had searched Malcolm's name in the bank's personnel database before the confrontation, meaning he knew exactly who he was stopping. The moment the charges were made public, U.S. Marshals tracked Rick to a motel on the outskirts of Delaware, less than 2 hours from the state line. He had packed bags, his bank account had been drained of over $50,000, and his phone's location had been disabled. But it wasn't enough. He was taken into custody without incident, though bystanders reported that Rick appeared dazed, like a man who had expected someone, somewhere, to still come to his defense. He was booked, arraigned, and held on bail. That same day, Chad Benson's legal team received word that he too would face charges, this time for obstruction of justice, retaliatory workplace conduct, and malicious suppression of internal compliance. Though he hadn't fled, the weight of evidence against him was staggering, and the possibility of jail time had shifted from rumor to reality. After a closed-door meeting with his attorneys and a brief appearance before the DA's office, Chad made a decision that shocked no one. He accepted a plea deal. In exchange for reduced sentencing, Chad agreed to cooperate fully with federal investigators, turning over records, naming accomplices, and confirming the systematic patterns of suppression and discrimination he had implemented and overseen. He gave up access to his executive accounts, surrendered his corporate perks, and provided detailed testimony implicating not just Rick, but 3 additional senior executives, 2 of whom had quietly resigned during the early stages of the audit, and one who was still technically employed. For victims of the bank's toxic culture, It was a turning point not defined by spectacle, but by substance. The legal system was catching up to the crimes, and accountability was no longer symbolic, it was tangible. Word of the arrest spread quickly, not just in the news, but in internal group chats and email threads among current and former employees. The mood was complex, part vindication, part wariness. Justice was being served, but for many, the scars of years under Rick and Chad's reign wouldn't disappear overnight. Malcolm understood that better than anyone. That's why, the moment the legal proceedings gained traction, he redirected his focus to ensuring the victims were not left behind in the wake of legal victory. Working closely with the bank's newly installed ethics counsel and civil litigation experts, Malcolm spearheaded a resolution initiative, one designed to acknowledge the harm, offer compensation, and guarantee protections moving forward. Within 2 weeks, the bank reached a confidential settlement agreement with over 30 former and current employees. The terms varied depending on each case, but the framework was consistent. Formal apology letters from the institution, financial compensation scaled to the extent of damages suffered, guarantees of non-retaliation, and career rehabilitation support for those whose trajectories had been derailed. One by one, survivors of the system were given a chance to speak, to be heard, and to be made whole, not just in headlines, but in ways that could restore dignity and control over their futures. Internally, Hamilton Central Bank initiated sweeping policy reforms. A third-party firm was contracted to rebuild HR from the ground up. Diversity and equity training was no longer optional. It was mandatory, intensive, and ongoing. A new oversight committee, chaired by Malcolm himself, was created to ensure compliance, transparency, and ethical conduct across every level of the institution. But for all the action taken behind closed doors, the public narrative was harder to mend. Though the bank had moved swiftly in the wake of exposure, many in the community saw the steps as reactionary, too late to undo the years of silent complicity. Protesters continued to hold weekly rallies outside the building. Community leaders demanded external audits at sister institutions. Some clients pulled their accounts, choosing instead to support credit unions or community banks. Hamilton's brand had become a warning, a case study in corporate negligence. And though legal justice was unfolding, moral trust was harder to restore. Malcolm never asked the public to forgive. He never delivered a speech asking for unity. Instead, he remained steady in his mission, understanding that trust was not something to be begged for. It had to be rebuilt one brick at a time. In quiet meetings, he spoke with young interns who had considered quitting. He mentored mid-level managers, now rising in the ranks, with newfound confidence. He met with victims personally, often off-record, to hear their pain and offer something that had long been missing in the culture of Hamilton: empathy. Meanwhile, Rick's trial date was set for the following quarter. Legal analysts speculated on sentencing, but most agreed the evidence was overwhelming. Chad's cooperation, meanwhile, had effectively buried any chance of a return to corporate life. His name had been scrubbed from Hamilton's leadership archives. His bonuses were frozen. His resignation had been finalized with a non-disclosure agreement that no longer held weight in public perception. He had traded his career for freedom, but even that came with strings. He was no longer a power broker. He was a pariah. As the institution continued its long road to repair, a new kind of silence settled over the building, one not born of fear or suppression, but of rebuilding. Gone were the whispers of retaliation in hallways. The morning light filtered through the glass canopy above Hamilton Central Bank's lobby, casting wide streaks across the polished marble floor, where only weeks' earlier chants of protest had echoed through the air. Now, the chants had quieted, the protest signs had come down, and the media trucks had moved on to the next scandal in a country forever hungry for outrage. But something far more important remained. Change, not the fleeting kind born from headlines, but the stubborn, deliberate kind, was still unfolding in every office, conference room, and hallway inside the towering building that had once turned away its own reckoning. Malcolm Harris stood on the sidewalk across the street, holding the same black briefcase that had once been labeled suspicious, the same one that had been forcibly opened under false assumptions, the same one that had carried their own truth, termination notices for those who had been the cancer of the institution. Now, it held something different: his contract, his plan, his new title. After months of audit leadership, internal policy reform, cultural reset strategies, and overseeing the legal aftermath of one of the most devastating institutional exposures in modern corporate history, the board had approached Malcolm with a final offer: not a consulting role, not another advisory gig, but the position of Chief Ethics and Integrity Officer, a role newly created and placed one rung below the CEO, designed to act as both guardian and architect of Hamilton's new culture. At first, he hesitated, not because he doubted his qualifications or his value or even the sincerity of the offer, but because staying meant anchoring himself to the site of a trauma. It meant waking up every day and walking into the place that had once treated him like a threat for simply existing, that had only opened its ears after its secrets were exposed. But as he reviewed the proposal late into the night, sitting in his small apartment surrounded by the quiet glow of city lights, he realized the decision was not about comfort. It was about duty. There was power in leaving, yes, but there was transformation in staying. Walking away would send a message. Staying would shape the future. He accepted the position, not for prestige, not for the corner office, but for everyone who never had a chance to make it through the lobby. Now standing across the street, he straightened his tie, adjusted his grip on the briefcase, and waited for the signal to change. He thought of Olivia, the brave teller who first spoke out during the audit. He thought of Marcus, who had once been passed over for promotion 3 times despite stellar performance reviews. He thought of Peter, the quiet whistleblower who had risked everything by handing over that hard drive. And he thought of Valerie Clark, who had unlocked the final gate to justice by exposing Chad's handwritten schemes. Their stories didn't vanish with the end of the news cycle. Their courage was now codified into training manuals, compliance frameworks, leadership pipelines, and policy initiatives. Their pain had not been erased. It had been respected. When the crosswalk sign blinked white, Malcolm stepped forward and crossed the street, each footstep echoing a little louder as he neared the building that had once arrested him. This time, the security guard at the door didn't flinch. He opened it with a quiet nod, and Malcolm returned the gesture. No hostility, no posturing, just mutual recognition. Malcolm entered the lobby slowly, eyes sweeping across the space. The once sterile atmosphere now featured a mural on the east wall, unveiled just days prior, a series of abstract, sweeping lines converging at a center point, each color representing voices once unheard, now drawn into unity. Beneath it read a plaque, "From silence to purpose, in honor of those who spoke." Malcolm didn't stop to admire it long. He simply let it register. It wasn't just art, it was proof. He passed the check-in desk, where a new diversity hire program had reshaped the frontline staff in just weeks. He exchanged a quiet greeting with a young Latino intern who looked at him with a mix of awe and gratitude. People had started to refer to the transformation at Hamilton as the Harris effect, but Malcolm dismissed the label every time. This wasn't about him. It never had been. He took the elevator up to the 20th floor, where his new office awaited. It wasn't the largest or flashiest, but it had been intentionally designed beside the team break room, symbolic of his belief that proximity to the people mattered more than separation by glass and title. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and set the briefcase on the desk. He exhaled deeply, not out of exhaustion, but out of clarity. His phone buzzed with a calendar alert. In 15 minutes, he was scheduled to host his first official town hall as Chief Ethics and Integrity Officer. The entire bank would be watching virtually. He drafted his remarks carefully. They weren't about spinning hope or packaging progress into palatable soundbites. They were about responsibility, honesty, and the necessity of keeping wounds visible so they never become infected again. When the stream began, he stood in front of a simple backdrop, the new mission statement behind him. He looked directly into the camera and began, "Many of you know me as the man with the briefcase, the man who was stopped, profiled, detained, But today, I stand here not to revisit the injustice, but to make sure this institution never forgets it. What happened here wasn't a one-time mistake. It was the result of choices, conscious, repeated choices made by people who valued power over people. And those choices cost this institution its soul. But this isn't where the story ends. This is where it begins again. Throughout the bank, people stopped what they were doing to listen. Some stood. Some sat in silence. Others wiped away tears. Rebuilding trust, he continued, isn't a campaign. It's a contract. A contract that must be renewed every day through action, accountability, and humility. We are not here to look good. We are here to be good, to do right, to own what we once ignored. And if we do that together, we will not just be forgiven, we will be transformed. When he finished, the broadcast ended without applause. It wasn't needed. Silence, this time, was not born of fear. It was respect. Malcolm returned to his office, sat behind the desk, and opened the briefcase. Inside, beyond the paperwork and policies, sat a simple leather notebook. On the first page was a quote he had written months ago during the early days of the audit. It read, "Justice is not just what we correct, it's what we create next." He stared at the line for a moment, then picked up his pen and began drafting the next page. The end. If you're still here, thanks for watching this story unfold. If you enjoyed it or found it powerful, make sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. What did you think of the plot? Did anything surprise you? And where are you watching from? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'm reading them all and would love to know how this story hit for you.